What if I told you that one of the most terrifying execution methods in human history might never have actually happened? Not once, not ever, anywhere. And yet, for over 1,000 years, people have believed it. Historians have written about it. Movies have recreated it. TV shows have made it their most talked about scene. I'm talking about the Blood Eagle. The story goes like this. They flip you onto your stomach. They cut along your spine. They pull your ribs outward through your back like wings. And then, while you're still alive, they pull your lungs out and lay them over your shoulders. Sounds impossible to survive. Sounds impossible to even do. So here's the question that's going to drive this entire video. Did the Vikings actually do this, or did we all fall for one of the greatest myths in medieval history? Stick around, because the answer is stranger than either option. Let's start with where this legend even comes from, because it's not one story, it's several, and they don't all agree with each other. That's your first clue that something's off. The most famous version involves a man named Ivar. You may have heard of him from a certain TV show. According to Norse legend, Ivar's father was killed by an Anglo-Saxon king named Ælla, thrown into a pit of venomous snakes. Brutal way to go. So Ivar and his brothers sailed to England for revenge, and when they finally captured Ælla, the sagas say they didn't just kill him, they performed the Blood Eagle. Now here's where it gets interesting, because this story wasn't written by anyone who was there. It was written 300 years after it supposedly happened, by Christian monks and Icelandic poets who never met Ivar, never met Ælla, and had every reason to make Vikings look like monsters. Does that mean it's false? Not necessarily, but it does mean we have to ask, are we reading history or are we reading propaganda dressed up as history? Stick around, because there is a second account that changes everything. The Blood Eagle doesn't just show up once, it shows up in the Orkneyinga Saga, describing a Viking earl named Einar, who supposedly did the exact same ritual to his rival named Halfdan. Two separate stories, two separate sets of victims, same exact method. Now, at first, that sounds like confirmation, right? If two unrelated sources describe the same ritual, doesn't that make it more credible? Here's the twist. Historians noticed something strange. The language used to describe the Blood Eagle in the original Old Norse actually isn't clear at all. The phrase used is something like carving an eagle on someone's back, and in Viking poetry, something called skaldic verse, that phrase was often used symbolically. Eagles were everywhere in Norse battle poetry. They were said to feast on the bodies of the slain after every battle. It's a common, almost throwaway poetic image for death on the battlefield. So which is it? A real ritualized execution or a metaphor that later writers took literally? This is where actual scholars have spent decades arguing, and one woman's research turned the whole debate upside down. In the 1980s, a historian named Roberta Frank went back to the original Old Norse texts, not the translations, not the retellings, the actual medieval language, and made an argument that shook Viking scholarship. Her theory, the Blood Eagle wasn't a literal ritual at all. It was a poetic misreading. She argued that later saga writers, writing centuries after the Viking Age had ended, took old poetic lines about eagles tearing at a fallen warrior's back, meant purely as imagery for death on the battlefield,
and reinterpreted them literally. They turned a metaphor into a torture method.
In other words, nobody carved anyone's lungs out. A poet said something like, "The eagle tore his back," meaning he died and the birds came for his corpse. And generations later, that phrase got taken as an actual step-by-step ritual. If she's right, the blood eagle isn't Viking history. It's a translation error that became a legend. But, and this is important, not everyone agrees with her, and the pushback might surprise you. Here's what the other side argues. First, the Vikings were not strangers to brutal ritualistic violence. We have actual archaeological evidence of blood sacrifice, of bodies deliberately displayed after execution, of Norse warriors engaging in extreme acts tied to religious belief, particularly around the worship of Odin, who was deeply associated with eagles, ravens, and death. Second, multiple independent saga traditions describe this ritual with strikingly similar details. If it were purely a poetic misunderstanding, why would separate writers working in different regions describe the exact same physical process, the spine, the ribs, the lungs? Third, and this is the part most people don't know, some historians argue the blood eagle may not have been about torture at all. It may have been about symbolism and terror, a public execution designed to send a message to enemies. This is what happens to those who cross us. Even if it was performed quickly or on someone already dead, the visual alone would have been enough to terrify an entire kingdom. So, maybe the real question isn't, did it happen exactly as described? Maybe the real question is, why did people need to believe it did? Think about who was writing these stories down. Christian scribes, centuries after Christianity had replaced Norse paganism across Scandinavia and Britain. These writers had a very clear incentive: paint the old pagan warlords as savage, inhuman monsters, and paint the new Christian order as civilization arriving to save everyone from barbarism. A gruesome, invented ritual does exactly that job. It doesn't matter if it's true, it matters that it's memorable, horrifying, and reinforces exactly the story the writers wanted told. So, here's the uncomfortable possibility. The blood eagle might be one of history's earliest examples of a smear campaign, using shock value to define an entire culture by its worst possible caricature. Sound familiar? It should. We still do this today. But here's the twist that most documentaries never tell you. There's one more piece of evidence rarely mentioned, and it might be the most important one. No forensic evidence, not one skeleton, not one grave, not a single archaeological find in over 1,000 years of Viking excavation has ever shown injuries consistent with the blood eagle. Zero. For a ritual supposedly performed on kings and rival warlords, high-status individuals whose remains would have been notable, sometimes even buried with ceremony, you'd expect something. A rib pattern, a spinal cut, anything. There's nothing. Which means, after everything, the sagas, the scholars, the arguments on both sides, the blood eagle survives today not because we have proof. It survives because it's a perfect story. Horror, revenge, spectacle, and just enough historical texture to feel real. So, myth or reality? Here's where I land. The Vikings absolutely practiced ritual violence, absolutely used execution as a political message, and absolutely inspired fear across an entire continent. But the blood eagle exactly as described, spine split, ribs spread like wings, lungs laid outside the body while the victim breathes, most likely never happened, not the way the legend says. What we're left with is something almost more interesting than the myth itself,
a 1,000-year-old game of telephone where a poetic phrase about eagles feeding on the dead slowly transformed into one of history's most infamous torture methods. The Vikings didn't need to invent the blood eagle to be terrifying. We did that part for them. So, now I want to know what you think. Poetic metaphor turned legend, or a real ritual we just can't prove? Drop your theory in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want the next video in your feed to be the truth behind Viking berserkers, smash that subscribe button, because that myth might be even wilder than this one.